Hi, I'm Jeff Blue. Welcome to Class Cuts American History, and today we're going to be going over one of the most simultaneously best and worst times in American history.
Mr. Blue, are we on Nixon already?
No, historical self. Brown McConnell just went over the Gilded Age. Why would we be on Nixon already? Well, at least you know that Nixon wasn't the worst guy ever. I mean, we do have clean air because of him. Well, cleaner, anyway. I'm talking about the turn of the century, from the 1890s and the end of the Gilded Age, all the way to the end of World War I, or I guess the Great War as it was called in 1918. Spoiler alert, it is not as great as the name suggests. The turn of the century was a very dynamic time indeed for America. We saw everything from the corrupt corporate America of the Gilded Age to the rise of progressivism in response to this. Another major event in the turn of the century was the massive tide of immigration that stemmed from the economic success in America at the time. And also, you know, all the people who were fleeing Europe because a great big storm was brewing, and that storm was called...
Oh, Mr. Blue, Hitler.
No, historical self. As usual, you got the question wrong because you didn't listen to the first half because you were asleep. No, that storm was called the Great War. The war to end all wars. The largest war the world had ever seen. Well, that is until some German soldier thought he'd make an even bigger one than the one he had already fought in. But we'll get to that later. Right now, we talk about the progressives. Even though we aren't directly covering the Gilded Age, there are many of its effects that carry over and largely caused the early 1900s progressive era. Large companies continue to lead the transition of the United States from a rural agricultural economy into an industrialized urban one. Industrialization brought with it a slew of benefits. Long-distance travel was easier than it had ever been, and the relatively new invention of the telephone and the discovery of radio waves, communication was also on its way to vastly improve. However, there were many problems with industrialization that, in the opinion of many, outweighed its benefits. For starters, the competition between rival businesses led to pursuit of unethical or unfair business practices, which especially harmed the working class. Many of these workers were immigrants, and the long hours and atrocious working conditions didn't help the fact that they were vastly underpaid already, mostly because they were immigrants. As industrialization improved the quality of life for the middle and upper classes, it created a large social gap which left much of the lower and working class impoverished. Progressives rose to combat these disastrous effects, as well as the political corruption which had also formed, ushering in the progressive era. While most of these people would see these problems as, well, a problem, magazines saw them with dollar signs in their eyes. Bring in the muckrakers! Working mostly on both state and local levels, these investigative journalists worked to find the muck of society and rake it up into the view of the public. They were key to exposing the corruption in big business and government. These efforts were widely known, with notable examples including Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which exposed the inhumane and highly unsanitary practices of the meatpacking industry, or Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, which brought to light the squalid living conditions in the New York slums at the time. The public outcry that resulted from their investigations helped lead to legislation that helped protect both the worker and the consumer, such as the Meat Inspection Act, which helped to reduce the contamination in food products, or the New York Tenement House Act of 1901, which required that tenement housing be safer, cleaner, and more spacious. And don't think we forgot about you, women. In fact, some of the most famous progressive muckrakers were in fact women. Take, for example, Ida B. Wells, a born slave who became an activist who published Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in all its phases, which described many of the social injustices that prevailed in the South. Wells went on to be a very influential member in the early civil rights movement and even was one of the founding members of the NAACP in 1901. The progressives saw the federal government as a powerful tool that could be harnessed to improve society by regulating the economy, expanding democracy, and generating moral reforms. Reformers were able to influence the passage of many of these key pieces of legislation, including several amendments. The 16th Amendment established a federal income tax. The 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of U.S. senators, and the 18th Amendment established prohibition. The 19th Amendment also gave women the right to vote. They also used the federal government to regulate monopolies through trust busting. Progressives saw antitrust laws as a way to promote fair competition between legitimate competitors. Examples of such laws include the Hepburn and Mencken Acts, which extended the authority of the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the railroad and telecommunications industries, which also helped prevent monopolies. Oh, it's time for the mysterious manuscript? The rules of this game are simple. Director Taylor gives me a document from the magical microwave time machine. I guess what it is. If I get it right, yay. If not, I get a bucket of water poured on my head. Let's go. Alright. Let a man so much as scrape his finger, pushing a truck in the pickle rooms, and all the joints in his fingers might be eaten by acid one by one. Of the butchers and floormen, the beef boners, the trimmers, and all those who use knives, you could scarcely find a person who had the use of his thumb. Time and time again, the base of hit was a mere lump of flesh against which the man pressed the knife to hold. Ugh. They would have no nails. They would have worn and pulled them off hide. Okay, well, obviously, this is a muckraker document because it has very gross depictions of, like, people in the meatpacking industry. Ugh. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle? Yay! Despite being relatively unified in their effort, there are still many issues that divided the progressives, which leads me to some of the major contradictions of progressivism. While a key component of progressivism was fighting against the exploitation of workers caused by the efficiency principles of the Taylorism philosophy, Taylorism was also a part of progressivism in itself. Many progressives call for greater reliance on professional and technical experts to make the government more efficient. They believe that efficiency and expertise in the government would lead to the social and economic changes that they're so heavily striving for. This shows how many progressivist principles were contradictory as they advocated both expanding popular participation in government, as seen by the 17th Amendment, as well as the government controlled by professional and technical experts, as they simultaneously fought for the rights of their citizens, but they also simultaneously fought for prohibition, a principle that inherently limits rights. The same could also be said about their disagreement about immigration restriction this time, including the Immigration Act of 1917 and the National Quota Law of 1921, which severely limited international immigration based on nationality. Labor unions supported such restrictions on immigration because they claimed that immigration was the cause of low wages and harsh working conditions. For some reason. How progressives handle Southern segregation and discrimination was also very different. Booker T. Washington, an African-American progressive reformer, argued that instead of directly fighting against such injustices, African Americans should develop themselves educationally in order to become self-sufficient in American society in order to not compete with white Americans at all. His opinion was met with criticism from some other progressivists, including W.E.B. Du Bois, a fellow African-American reformer, who instead argued that African Americans should constantly fight for racial equality when he stated, quote, "It is not enough for the Negro to declare that color prejudice is the sole cause of their social condition, nor for the white South to reply that their social condition is the main cause of prejudice. They both act as a reciprocal cause and effect. A change in neither alone will bring the desired effect. Both must change, or neither can improve to any great extent. Only by a union of intelligence and sympathy across the color line, in this critical period of the Republic, shall justice and right triumph." While the progressives were fighting amongst themselves on different social issues, another debate was going on concerning the environment. The large corporations of the Gilded Age often misused natural resources with wasteful and environmentally harmful practices. Americans had developed the mentality that America had this inexhaustible supply of natural resources, and that simply wasn't true. Most people agreed this was a problem, but the solution to that problem was highly debated over. Conservationists supported the careful and ethical use of natural resources, while preservationists were against any and all human interaction with nature. The most notable conservationist was John Muir, president of the Sierra Club, and the man who inspired the creation of Yosemite National Park. Speaking of national parks, they were one of the only things that both the preservationists and the conservationists supported. Because of this shared agenda, many parks were established during this time period, including the aforementioned Yosemite National Park in 1890, as well as the very first national park, Yellowstone National Park, in 1872. Another major thing that was going on in this time was the rise in nativist thinking and restrictions on and discrimination on immigrants. From the year 1880 to the end of World War I, there are 11 different immigration acts aimed at restricting immigration, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which let laborers only stay here for 10 years, and banned naturalization. The Anarchist Exclusion Act of 1903, which prohibited immigration of anyone who was an anarchist, had epilepsy, was a beggar, or an importer of prostitutes. At least I got some of those four right. One of the biggest restrictions on immigration was the Immigration Act of 1917, or the Barred Zone Act, which created an Asiatic Barred Zone, which is basically a giant rectangle over Asia, saying that no one from these countries may enter America as a way to contain the so-called Yellow Peril. That sounds like something another U.S. president did recently with another group of countries. I'm looking at you, Trump. While these laws were restricted, they did not set the infamous quota immigration system that was created after World War I that Josh and Jessica will be talking about in a couple of minutes. During this time, on the other side of the world, some Russian dude named Vlad would read a little book by some German guy with a beard about this weird new idea called communism, where everyone will be totally rich and great and no one will be hungry, if we kill the rich king and czars, and steal their means of production and give it to the people, that is. He also passed this book along to a lot of his Bolshevik buddies. They all thought that it was a good idea, I guess. So they had a glorious October Revolution in the middle of November of 1917. This, of course, established the Soviet Union, which would go from some revolutionaries in a frozen wasteland to the perpetual antagonists in America's comic book series about themselves. Now, America had long been scared of people like anarchists, mostly from the country of France, but the creation of the Soviet Union and the advent of communism led to a new kind of scare, a red one, because apparently naming perils and scares after a color was a popular thing at the time. This would only add more fuel to the nativist fire that was ready to spark and become a total inferno in the 1920s that Josh and Jessica will probably be talking about in a few minutes. And now we're going to get into one of my absolute favorite parts of world history, a world war! One involving Germany, Britain, France, Russia, Italy, the Soviet Union, and America. But no fascism and almost no Hitler.
Excuse me, Mr. Blue, aren't Russia and...
Before you tell me, historical self, that Russia and the Soviet Union are the same thing, trust me, they are not. This war was, of course, the First World War, World War I, though they didn't really call it that because they were really hoping that this war would end all others. Instead, it was called the Great War because it was so great. Not really good, just great at like shattering the trust between countries and shattering countries themselves and making some really mad and vengeful at others and committing horrible war atrocities that scarred millions of people. The political landscape of Europe at the time was a tumultuous and confusing one, full of alliances, pacts, and secret treaties. This basically turned Europe into a minefield, making any small conflict between countries explode by dragging everyone else into it, which is basically what happened in 1914. Basically, the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Ferdinand, decided to go for a little drive through Serbia so they would, join his empire. Serbia, however, absolutely hated this dude, so they tried to kill him. He got lucky, however, and their attempts failed. So what did he do? Did he do the sensible thing and leave? No, he stayed to finish the parade and got shot and then died, after they threw a grenade at his car. So this made Austria-Hungary really mad, causing them to declare war, and also made their buddy Germany mad and declare war. Austria-Hungary was part of the Triple Alliance, consisting of it and Germany, but also Italy. When Serbia went running to Russia to get help, and Russia got its buddy France in on the whole thing, Italy decided to jump ship and join the Triple Entente, consisting of Russia, France, and Britain, which made Germany even more mad. So because of Russia, Germany decided to declare war on France as well, and decided to invade France by marching straight through Britain's buddy, Belgium. Then Germany got Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire involved, and made their new club called the Central Powers, and the Allies got Japan and Portugal involved, and soon all Europe and then some was in this great big war, and lots of countries got caught in the crossfire. It's also important to know just how crazy of a war this was, and with that understanding, it's very easy to see why many people, including President Woodrow Wilson, were not that eager to get involved in all the fun. Before this, President Wilson had a very isolationist policy that was able to effectively evade joining the war despite persistent attempts from the Allies. Even after the infamous sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which so many people, myself included, often incorrectly say was the cause of the U.S. entering the war, and while it did put many Americans on the side of the warmongers, it did not sway Wilson's declaration of U.S. neutrality. Wilson and Congress would also go on to pass the National Defense Act of 1916, which would go on to expand the powers of the Army and National Guard, create the first aviation department as part of the Army, and also create the ROTC, something very near and dear to my heart. Despite all this military mobilization, he didn't actually declare war, which made a lot of people happy and actually won him the re-election, with the Democrats using the slogan, "He kept us out of war," to sway public opinion. This is particularly ironic because he would quickly get us into war like a year after he got elected. Why? Well, as previously mentioned, it was not the sinking of the Lusitania that got us into the war. It mostly had to do with the Zimmerman telegram, a secret message sent from Germany to Mexico basically saying, "Hey Mexico, remember all that land that America took from you way back when? We'll help you get that back if you help us fight America." Mexico proceeded to say, "Are you freaking crazy?" and didn't end up fighting America. Soon Britain found out about the telegram and told the US about it. This, along with Germany resuming their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, is what caused America to declare war, not the sinking of the Lusitania. Soon after, the Selective Service Act of 1917 was passed, creating a new draft. About 2 million men, who later became known as the American Expeditionary Forces, were sent over to France under the command of General of the Army's John J. Pershing to fight alongside France, Britain, Canada, Italy, and Australia against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Fun fact, General of the Army's John J. Pershing is the highest-ranking U.S. Army officer in history, being the only man to receive the rank of General of the Army's while alive. Washington got it after he was dead. Although the American Expeditionary Forces didn't really do that much combat-wise, they did help tipped the balance of conflict in favor of the Allies. To fund the war effort, Liberty loans, which were basically just war bonds, began getting sold en masse. Now's a good time to point out that there were still a lot of Americans who didn't want to go to war and tried to convince others of the same, like creating anti-war and anti-government rallies and telling people not to buy Liberty loans. The US responded with one of its most controversial laws in history, the Sedition Act of 1918, which basically said if you say anything bad about the government, the military, the war, or try to keep anyone from buying war bonds, we will literally throw you in jail for no reason for however long we feel like it. Soon, however, on November 11, 1918, World War I came to an end with the signing of the Armistice of Compiègne, and the Sedition Act was repealed shortly thereafter. Immediate effects of the war were mostly territorial changes, such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire falling apart, Poland becoming independent. Germany would lose a bunch of land, which would make a man with a mustache pretty upset. Yugoslavia became a thing, and the Ottoman Empire fell apart, marking the fall of the very last major nation run by nomadic tribes. As you might remember from world history, nomadic tribes never had a huge effect on the world, unless, of course, you are the Mongols. Soon, before the war ended, Woodrow Wilson gave his famous 14-point speech, which gave his view for a post-Great War Europe and the world at whole. These 14 points were 1. No secret treaties. 2. Absolute free navigation of the seas. 3. Opening of free trade. 4. Reduction of arms. 5. Fair decisions and treatments of colonies. 6. Russian territory would be restored to before the war. 7. Belgium would become independent. 8. The liberation of France. 9. Italy's borders be redrawn to gain more Italians. 10. The dissolution of Austria-Hungary. 11. The Balkans borders be redrawn. 12. Non-Turks and former Ottoman territory may become independent. 13. Poland became independent. And 14. And the most important, the absolutely most important one you need to remember for that AP exam, a League of Nations would be created for countries to talk things out before going to war. This League of Nations was further discussed at the Paris Peace Conference, where 32 countries and nationalities sat down to discuss the fate of the former Central Powers. The Big Four, or the leaders of the US, the UK, Italy, and France, met over 145 times and made almost every major decision. There were actually 5 different peace treaties agreed upon to basically punish the former Central Powers for causing the war. These included the Treaty of Versailles for Germany, the Treaty of Saint-Germain for Austria, the Treaty of Neuilly for Bulgaria, the Treaty of Trianon for Hungary, the Treaty of Sèvres, and the Treaty of Lausanne, both for the Ottoman Empire, all of which redefined the borders for their respective nations, but kept the country itself mostly intact.
Except Turkey, Turkey makes a brand new Turkey.
After the Paris Conference, the League of Nations was officially founded on the 10th of January 1920, with its mission of keeping world peace and freedom led by a strong democratic leaders that totally worked out in the end, right? Well, no. If you didn't notice, the League of Nations doesn't really exist anymore, and that's for one big reason. While Wilson was busy convincing the rest of the world to join, he probably should have been convincing America to join. While many senators were for the US signing the Treaty of Versailles and joining the LN, there were a few who opposed it. These senators generally fell into 2 groups. Those who wanted to pass it with some changes, called the reservationists, and those who did not want to ratify the treaty at all, and those were called the irreconcilables. The reservationists, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, most Republicans and some Democrats did want to sign the treaty and did want to join the LN, but mostly wanted to fix Article 10 of the League of Nations Covenant, which basically said that the LN could make America go to war without Congress's approval, which I can see why they kind of didn't want that. Lodge's reservationists nearly got the treaty ratified, but Wilson rejected their proposal, and in the end, it was the irreconcilables that won, with the Treaty of Versailles never actually getting ratified by America, and America never even joining the League of Nations in the end. This would ultimately lead to its downfall, as without the US, the League of Nations could not effectively execute, well, anything. In 1946, after World War II, the League of Nations would fall apart and be replaced by the UN that we know and love today. I mean, that's such a shame. Like, the League of Nations is such a cooler name. I mean, look at that logo, right? Who doesn't love stars? In the end, World War I and its aftermath intensified, not solved, ongoing debates about our nation's role in the world and how best to achieve national security and pursue American interests. And most of these debates would remain unanswered because America would basically readopt an isolationist policy, and these debates would not be resolved until World War II. Also, the fact that there even was a World War II shows that sadly, in the end, World War I was definitely not the war to end all wars. But World War II was not part of our assignment, so I'll let Josh and Jessica talk about that right now. Thanks for sitting through our video. Class Cuts is a parody of John Green's Crash Course US History, and was made from his Berkeley's 5th period A-Push class. The script was written by myself and my good friend Taylor Smith, who's behind the camera. Camera work, video editing, and original animation was also done by Taylor Smith. Any other animation bits were taken from Crash Course or the fun history hero Bill Wirtz. Special thanks to Mr. Lowe for letting us use his room and his cameras to record this, Mr. Caggiano for lending us his globe, and to my Aunt Titiani for giving me this dinosaur in middle school that I finally found a use for. And thanks to Miss Berkeley for being such a great teacher and making all of this possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. And always remember to be cool!